And firms that are investing or thinking about investing in those kind of mega projects should be targeted by civil society organizations.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. There was an international call for solidarity actions on January 19th with anti-invasion Russian activists who are being persecuted in Putin's Russia. A group in New York City gathered on that date in Union Square. Talking now with Bill Weinberg, who does a great podcast called Counter Vortex, and we're here in
Union
Square Park in Manhattan. What do you think?
Well, for several years, Syria Solidarity New York City held a weekly Friday evening vigil here in Union Square in solidarity with the protesters in Syria and the civil resistance in Syria, which has been mobilizing every Friday since the beginning of the Syrian revolution in 2011. And we've been, trying to raise a voice of support for the people under bombardment, under Russian bombardment in Syria for all these years. And now we're trying to raise a voice of support for the people of Ukraine who are under Russian bombardment. And critically today, for the Russians who oppose Putin and his fascistic regime and his criminal aggressions in Syria and Ukraine. Since the invasion began last February, in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, there was a huge mass mobilization of anti-war protesters all over Russia. Something like 15,000 were arrested. And many of them are still behind bars today. Many of them are facing lengthy prison terms merely for protesting, merely for raising a voice of dissent against the invasion of Ukraine. And those are the Russians who need our support, not Putin and his gang in the Kremlin, who unfortunately many deluded pseudo-leftists here in the United States seem to think we should be supporting. January 19th is a International Day of Action, which has been called by the now exiled Russian anti-war opposition in solidarity with imprisoned anti-war protesters in Russia. So hopefully we're here today in Union Square in New York City. We're just one of several events around the world.
My name is Amina, and I'm with Syria Solidarity New York City. We're here in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and the people of Russia that are against the Russian aggression. Yeah, so we're here as Syria Solidarity New York City because we have the same struggle as the Russian people who want peace and are against Russian aggression. And
that was my next question. What happened in Syria?
Well, Russia's was... Since 2015, Russia has been trying out and rehearsing what they're doing now to the Ukrainian people. They did it, and they've been doing it to the people in Syria, committing war crimes, bombing civilian targets, and so forth.
I'm Walter Daum. I'm with the League for the Revolutionary Party. I'm also with Ukraine Socialist Solidarity. And I'd like to add to what Bill has said. It's important that socialists and other leftists be here because so many socialists and people calling themselves socialists and leftists in this country are in effect in support of the Russian attempt to crush Ukraine.
You've no doubt seen this apartment building in Dnipro, Ukraine, devastated by a Russian attack. This was the type of missile used. 1 ton of munitions in the bomb. It was designed to be used against aircraft carriers, and it was used against a fully occupied apartment building. 44 people were killed and many, many people injured. This is Putin's denazification campaign. The authoritarian bootlickers tried to use Martin Luther King Day as a way of stopping aid to Ukraine. This is an example of the signs they used at a march of a couple hundred people in New York City. Evidently, observers were expected to believe that NATO had invaded Ukraine. While we were in Union Square, we noticed on the side of a building the climate clock, which ticks down second by second the time until scientists say we go over the dreaded 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in world temperature. The site climateclock.world has a lot of information and photos and even a few lines of code that you could paste on your own site and get a clock of your own. Promoting Enduring Peace has had its own climate clock for years, counting down until 2030, when the scientists say we hit one or more tipping points. We still have time, slightly less than 7 years, but we're going to have to make some drastic changes. For ideas, go to pepeace.org. These pictures are from a series of tweets from Defend the Atlanta Forest. Activists there have been trying to stop the tearing down of 100 acres of a local forest to make way for a police training area. They've nicknamed it Cop City. The training site will be jammed up against a working-class Atlanta area whose residents will be victimized by the constant racket of shooting. The forest defenders have been occupying the area since last June, some living in the trees. On January 8th, one defender, Manuel Terran, who went by the name Tortuguita or Tort, was shot dead by police or a member of the SWAT team. Authorities have had changing stories, but claim that Tort shot at police and wounded a policeman, and they retaliated and killed him. The story seems suspect. Tort was known for advocating nonviolence, and all too conveniently, there's no police video of the incident. The great climate organization 350 sent out an email saying the killing of Tort was a murder. Definitely watch the coverage on Democracy Now! On January 20th, the segment about the clearing of the Atlanta forest. We have time now only to show this small segment.
Cop City is an idea that came after the 2020 uprisings by the City of Atlanta, the Atlanta Police Department, and the Atlanta Foundation, Atlanta Police Foundation. The idea basically is that they want to develop a militarized police base that's right next to a black and brown working class community. And by building this space, they want to cut down over 100 acres of forest. They want to develop an area where there's a room for explosives testing, over 12 firing ranges, a place where there's a Black Hawk helicopter landing pad, a training center for them to practice crowd control. We should also mention that they are engaged in international training with the Israeli police. And so we think this project really is the beginning of a militarized police base here in Atlanta.
So the Israelis, with their ADL brokered police exchanges, are involved too. Did their training encourage Atlanta police to see people who defend trees, neighborhoods, and the air as terrorists? And get this, to see what the police were saying about what happened, I went to the Atlanta Constitution website. At the end of their article was this note that Cox Enterprises, which owns the newspaper, was a contributor to the fundraiser for the police training facility. Also want to point out that on that same January 20th Democracy Now! Program, there's a segment on the killing by taser of Keenan Anderson by Los Angeles police. Anderson was a 10th grade English teacher. He was involved in a traffic accident. The facts of what happened are unclear, but at one point Anderson allegedly said, "They're trying to George Floyd me." Finally, more about the conference on how Saudi Arabia is whitewashing its image. The conference was arranged by the European Saudi Organization for Human Rights.
My contribution here today is a bit different. It's a bit broader. So I'm contributing today as a PhD researcher from the University of Bath. And the focus of my research is around the area of corporate social responsibility. So really, I look at the intersection of business and society. So I'm not really going to talk about like a specific violation as such, but I'm going to talk more holistically about the role of business and kind of how it intersects with issues such as whitewashing. I don't think it's possible to have a conversation about things such as whitewashing without bringing in business into that conversation. So one of the kind of key areas of research that I've been looking at is around the role of multinational and foreign companies who operate in Saudi Arabia or do business with the Saudi government. Because there's a kind of a recognition in the literature that firms can play a political role and enact political change. So I'm really interested in that dynamic in terms of the context of Saudi Arabia, in terms of the kind of human rights and democracy angle. And I understand that there is a frustration across the human rights community that many of the mechanisms that we use to address human rights concerns, such as the UN mechanisms or asking other states to intervene, can be very slow. And that comes with it a whole host of frustrations. So the way we see it is that firms or businesses can potentially be a leverage point for potentially civil society to activate to help enact some kind of positive change around the human rights landscape in Saudi Arabia. And that really comes from the idea that foreign direct investment, or FDI, is part of Vision 2030, and it's an integral part of MBS's plan, his blueprint for the future. So really, we see that firms can hold a very, very influential position in terms of trying to ask for change or initiate change even. So really, my research is to explore that dynamic in the Saudi context, and I'm in the process of interviews right now and I've interviewed like many civil society organizations, and I'm going to interview lots of corporations after the new year that operate or do business in Saudi Arabia with their headquarters. So currently, kind of my research is still in the kind of data collection phase. So I don't really have like any kind of conclusive findings to report here, but I do have some insights that might be useful or interesting. So I think one of the key insights that comes across is that when we talk about business, we can't really just talk about certain sectors of business. And I noticed there is a lot of focus on things, on kind of areas such as public relations companies or consulting firms, and rightly so, because they do have they directly feed into this idea of whitewashing or reputation laundering. And as well, there's a big focus on the sporting associations and kind of more individual level businesses, such as like music artists, influencers, athletes. But I think one thing I would say is that this idea of business, playing a political role is far more extensive than that, because obviously those types of businesses that I just mentioned, they directly feed in to issues such as whitewashing, either by actually helping the Saudi state to cover up for its violations, or by participating in events which have been designed to push a certain narrative that Saudi is modern, Saudi is whatever. But there are also a whole other host of businesses that should be included in this idea of targeting business with the view for political change. So in particular for Saudi Arabia, that could come as firms that are involved in mega projects that are kind of orchestrated by the Saudi state, such as NEOM. So obviously NEOM has been associated with forced displacement of local tribes, of the killing of activists, and firms that are investing or thinking about investing in those kind of mega projects should be targeted by civil society organizations. And actually there are human rights risks for any firm that might want to set up in Saudi Arabia, because there's always the risk that the firm's kind of business operations can become sites of violations. For example, we saw when Mohammed bin Salman was doing his corruption drive, he used the Ritz-Carlton as the site of torture for many of the people that he rounded up. And there's also big tech companies such as Google. That has become a really emerging theme so far. Google's considering setting up a data center in Saudi Arabia, and that obviously could have major implications for human rights defenders and for activists and their privacy and their data. So really, I mean, most of these multinationals or foreign firms, they are set up in headquarters, and their headquarters are in countries that are democratic countries. So they, there is a big onus on them to ensure that, democratic ideals are not violated when they decide to set up in authoritarian states. And obviously the UN guiding principles, they say that firms must mitigate or must, conduct their due diligence for human rights risks. But currently what I've seen is that there is a big gap right now in my research so far between civil society organizations and firms. And that is an area potentially that needs to be further explored by civil society organizations. And that's not to take away from the fact that the state, the Saudi state, is the perpetrator of these violations, but firms can be enablers of that, or firms can also be in a position to contest some of those violations. So this is potentially an area that could be kind of an avenue of exploration. So it's more just to raise the fact that business is an actor, an influential actor, and particularly as Saudi Arabia moves towards a kind of really focusing on their on developing their market and the economy, we find that business becomes a really, really important actor, a market-based actor that potentially civil society organizations should think about in terms of targeting and think about in terms of, advocacy. So what I would say, just to end there, is that is not an easy task, because one thing that I've kind of is becoming clear as part of my research is that this is a challenging area for civil society organizations, because they're used to speaking to state actors. They don't know how to talk to business. Business needs a different type of skill set. It needs a different repertoire of approaches. So that might be a potential area of development that might need to be addressed if this is an area that is civil society organizations are willing to explore. But that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Ahmed Al-Wadai will participate on the Saudi political efforts in using the British Parliament to cover up their abuses and violations. Good evening, and thank you for having me and for giving me the opportunity to participate. I will speak on the not only the British Parliament attempts, but also will focus on how Saudi Arabia uses the sports whitewashing in order to whitewash its violations and abuses. Also, I will speak about how some politicians were threatened and blackmailed, and also human rights organizations. I will speak first about, according to me, it was the worst event in this year, in 12 March, when Saudi Arabia had executed 81 persons. Many of them were from the eastern region. Execution was because they have protested against the royal family. This was a black, dark day in the history of Saudi Arabia. This is a historical day because in one day, 81 persons were actually executed. It's the worst day ever in the executions history. What I want to say here, how would such a day and what are the political consequences after this day? First of all, that Boris Johnson has visited Saudi Arabia. It happened after a few days from this execution. Despite there were pressures by the British media from some member of parliament who asked Boris Johnson to not go for this visit. This is a clear message to Mohammed bin Salman and to the royal family that UK can actually ignore such vicious violations for human rights, even though they were massive executions. For all, and after that, the visit happens, and also the war in Ukraine and the petroleum prices were encouraging for the Boris Johnson to not retreat from doing this visit in order to decrease the price of the petroleum. And the UK station is far more important than any other violations which were done by Saudi Arabia. Also, after days of this, the Formula One also a race happened in Saudi Arabia. First of all, it happened in Bahrain. Then the next phase was in Saudi Arabia. Also, this was a very curious date because they were clearly called for stopping this race because only 2 weeks have passed from executing 81 persons. And there was a very clear question to the Formula One management, CEO Stefano. They were questioned by journalists on how would you do such a race, although your business partner has committed such a crime. And the response was very ridiculous, actually. And this is what Saudi hopes, that the aim behind having this Formula One race is giving more legitimacy to the ruler and to its crimes, and show that Saudi Arabia is more open because it's the most important cars race being held in Saudi Arabia, in Jeddah city. This is the image which Saudi government wanted to transfer to the people. But what happened was the contrary. The world champion for 7 times in Formula One, Lewis Hamilton, criticized severely Saudi Arabia when he was asked by the journalists, was Formula One administration decision to have the race held in Saudi Arabia right? Hamilton said, I don't feel comfortable here. And I can't say that I feel comfortable, but unfortunately, it's not my decision. And sports took this decision on behalf of us. So Saudi Arabia actually had a very vicious media campaign which were covering the Formula One race. I believe that they were amongst the strongest media campaigns because the violations were really bold. And at the same time, the war against Yemen was still going on. And this was also ridiculous. How can the Formula One administration itself defend its decision in taking or in holding this race in Saudi Arabia, while Saudi Arabia executed 81 persons, war in Yemen was still on, and at the same time, the Formula One administration has actually withdrawn from Russia. So, how can this happen? At the same time, despite that, Saudi Arabia is waging a war against Yemen. The Formula One would actually ignore this fact and approves that Saudi hosts this event. So it becomes very clear here how Western hypocrisy and the multiple standards, dual standards, not only by the Western states and who spoke a lot about human rights standards, but when it comes for real and when the decision has to be taken against states, which they consider as allies, then all of these crimes committed by these rulers can be ignored as if nothing happened.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.